Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. You are listening to our special mini-series focused on peace negotiations and peace building in Ukraine. Join us as we hear from prominent figures who have played pivotal roles as lawyers, negotiators, and diplomats in the quest for peace in Ukraine. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Now, in recent months, there has been significant movement regarding negotiations to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. With our guests, we explore some of the key issues and challenges that will arise during these negotiations, how to tackle these issues head on, and what comes after the negotiations in terms of long-term peace building and stability in Ukraine. You'll hear from Ukrainian and international experts on issues ranging from territorial integrity, post-conflict elections, negotiating security guarantees, justice, reparations, and private sector investment. Now, today I'm honored to welcome Mykola Stetsenko, president of the Ukrainian Bar Association and managing partner at the leading Ukrainian law firm of Avelum. Mykola is an expert in corporate law, legal ethics, the rule of law, and legislative reforms, with a particular focus on international law and human rights. Mykola, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast. I'll be very happy to share my views on the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, and hope this will be helpful to the audience and your listeners.
Fantastic. I'm so excited and so looking forward to this conversation. And now in this episode, for our listeners, we'll be discussing the role of the private sector in Ukraine's post-war recovery and reconstruction. Now, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion in February of 2022, and obviously since the 2014 invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, Russian attacks have caused extensive damage to Ukraine's strategic and urban infrastructure, as well as its economy, as well as job loss, high inflation, and loss of assets. As Russia's attacks have continued and escalated over the past 3 years, Ukraine's recovery needs have only continued to grow. And as negotiations begin, it becomes ever more important to begin planning for Ukraine's post-war recovery and reconstruction. Today, we will consider the role that private investment can play in this planning as one of the tools among many for rebuilding Ukraine after the war is over. Some individuals estimate, or some entities and organizations estimate, that there are at least $176 billion in direct damage to buildings and infrastructure, and then maybe another $400 billion in lost GDP and the decline in investment. Mykola, can you give our listeners an overview of the reconstruction planning efforts so far and how private investment might be integrated into these plans to date, given the dramatic need for assistance with reconstruction, investment, rebuilding in Ukraine?
Yes, with pleasure. Well, Ukraine, in the course of the last several years, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, has taken this issue of reconstruction very seriously and has developed a whole range of institutions that are responsible for future reconstruction and attracting funding, and also providing clear access and mapping for the investors about the current projects and future projects. So there is a separate ministry for restoration that oversees rebuilding, infrastructure development, and overall restoration of Ukraine. There is, and there has been for decades, a state property fund of Ukraine that manages a lot of state-owned enterprises. Then there is a separate state agency for the restoration and development of infrastructure. And there are several ministries that also deal with issues of restoration. For example, Ministry of Energy obviously oversees issues of resilience and restoration of those assets that have been hardly hit by Russian attacks. And of course, there is an overarching support from the Ministry of Economy that is actually very active recently in promoting various opportunities in Ukraine. But apart from that, there are several platforms that attract funding and also provide opportunity for investors to see what is going on. And I would particularly like to mention a platform called Dream. It's a state digital ecosystem for accountable management that provides a single digital pipeline for all reconstruction projects. It's like a single window to work with restoration projects, and it's specifically targeted to foreign investors. So I encourage everyone interested in this to log in and into that system and see how it works. Apart from that, there are several initiatives that are being developed right now. One is called the Ukraine Development Fund, that is being set up in joint cooperation by BlackRock and JP Morgan, together with the Ukrainian government, of course. And it's a long-term strategy for a closed-end fund that will invest into several sectors of Ukrainian economy, such as infrastructure, energy, manufacturing, agriculture, and IT. And it will be both equity and debt, but admittedly, it's still work in progress. Another project that the government is pursuing is the EU-Ukraine Facility and Ukraine Plan, and it's a $50 billion program that is aimed to support Ukraine in form of loans and grants. And it's a program that is subject to performance of a Ukraine plan that contains a lot of reforms that the Ukrainian government undertook to implement in line with recommendations of the European Commission. So I'm pretty sure that I'm missing something because there are so many venues that the government is pursuing. But obviously, I would definitely watch for these that I just named.
Well, Mykola, it sounds like the Ukrainians, their partners in law firms, the European Union and others have created quite an infrastructure for recording what's needed for reconstruction and facilitating private investment. Can you walk our listeners through the basics of how private sector investment would work in reconstruction? And I say this since most of our listeners are human rights lawyers, human rights specialists, those that are interested in peace negotiations and post-conflict peace building. I think we have a few hundred corporate lawyers who also listen to us, but the vast bulk are social scientists. And you have this experience in international law, human rights, but also deep experience in private sector investment. How does this private sector investment actually work in terms of reconstruction?
Well, there are many venues where private investment can chip in. Before we talk about that, maybe let's take a step back and look at it from the general sources perspective. The reconstruction will probably be happening based on the state budget funding from the Ukrainian state budget, that of course will be receiving some funding directly from Russian frozen assets or direct loans or grants from international institutions or governments. So this is one venue. Another venue is international financial institutions like the World Bank, EBRD, IFC, that have been providing and will continue to provide support either to the Ukrainian government or to various projects like project finance transactions or to specific businesses as loans or equity investments. So this is another venue. And the third one is a huge area, which is broadly a private investment that we are talking about here. And in my view, the third area will probably be key in terms of long-term growth. It will probably be not the first one to start investing and implementing, but will definitely be fundamental for the long-term sustainability of the Ukrainian economy. And I jotted down just a few major venues where I think private investment would be appropriate. First of all, which is probably the fastest and the obvious one, is public procurement. So the government will want to reconstruct roads, bridges, infrastructure like ports, etc. And of course, they will announce tenders. And foreign companies, it's not particularly an investment, but that's an opportunity for them to come, bid for the tender, get the job, and do the job, because there will be so many construction projects that will be implemented that Ukrainian companies, and there are many Ukrainian construction companies, they won't be able to handle all of them. So there will be a need for technical expertise, manpower, equipment, etc. So this is one very simple way. And honestly, it's not an investment proper. It's actually just spending money by the Ukrainian government. Another one is different, is a private-public partnership, PPP. And Ukraine has updated modern legislation on PPPs, but it has not had an opportunity to implement that because it was adopted only just before the war began. In my view, this is a tremendous opportunity for the government now to use that framework to attract investors who will invest their money into these programs. For example, building a brand new highway that will have a more direct connection between Poland and Kiev that will be financed by major European institutions and implemented by a European company with the government, of course, guaranteeing certain minimum payments. And the third area is, everyone now is talking about natural resources and rare minerals, so we just cannot not mention it. Of course, licenses for natural resources extraction will be interesting to many investors, not only American investors. Ukraine is very rich in natural deposits of oil, gas, various rare minerals, graphite, titanium, etc. And for a long time, many of these deposits have not been actively developed. Some of them have not been even put for auctions. Others have been sold off into private hands, but have not been developed either, so they remain dormant. This will be a great opportunity for foreign investors. Then a fourth area is privatization. Many people don't realize, but in the course of the last 5 years, the Ukrainian government became full with very good assets, state-owned companies that have been either nationalized in the past or seized as confiscated assets. And the government already starts to do some privatization auctions. There have been several ones in the past year. We expect more this year. But honestly, after the war ends, there will be a lot of very lucrative companies that will be up for sale. The ones like Ukernafta, which is an equivalent of ExxonMobil in the United States, in Ukraine, or major gas corporation, Naftogaz, or some telecom companies, some electricity distribution companies. All of that will be very interesting. Another example, one of the major banks, probably the largest bank in Ukraine, Privatbank. There will be a lot of pressure and need for privatization of that. Two more areas, joint ventures with Ukrainian partners. I think we already see a lot of that happening in the defense sector. Joint ventures happening between the Ukrainian defense company, Ukroboronprom, and major defense arms producers. But I'm sure there will be more in other sectors. And finally, private equity funding. There have been for decades, and there are fresh examples of very efficient work of private equity funds, for example, Horizon Capital, who have brought their expertise and efficiencies to the market, invested into companies, grew these companies into larger market players, and then sold them off. I think this will be an important factor. In fact, Ukrainian private equity industry has a lot of experts who are very knowledgeable in that. Unfortunately, some of them left Ukraine, but I'm pretty sure that they will be happy to come back. So these are the 6 areas that come to mind immediately where private investors can find their niche and opportunities.
Well, Mykola, you prompted a number of questions from me with your articulation of these six areas. The first one is a very specific question on natural resources, which I realize is a politically sensitive topic. So I'm not interested in your views on the political dimension of it. But if you could walk us through a little bit about how investment in natural resources might play out from what we know about the leaked proposed agreement between the United States and Ukraine. And the reason why I'm asking this question is our listeners, and including myself, we read about this in the news and it makes no sense whatsoever, in part because we don't have a baseline understanding of how investment in natural resources would work, what's generally a fair share or the common practice for splitting the net, or is it the gross? How does it work when one entity, be it public or private, invests with the state or maybe with private entities for natural resource extraction? Procurement makes sense. There's a bid for $100 billion to build a highway. You bid on it, somebody wins it, they build the highway. Kosovo did this with its highway from Kosovo to Albania. Bechtel bid on it. They won the bid. It's straightforward. But Honestly, none of us really understand how natural resources investment and extraction works. Could you give us a little bit of a 101 seminar on that?
Sure. We actually had a very good case of a British American investor doing exactly that kind of investment literally before the full scale invasion. So, in the natural resources area, the common way to approach this is to have a production sharing agreement between the investor and the government. And the idea is fairly simple. If you submit a bid, and in Ukraine has a transparent electronic system for such bids, and your bid is successful for a particular area that you think as an investor will be interesting to explore, for example, for oil and gas, and you win that bid, then you enter into negotiations with the government on the details of your agreement with the government, which is called production sharing agreement. And the idea is that you as an investor put in some money for the exploration and hopefully then development of the field. And once you get the oil, for example, from the ground, you sell, you keep the profit, but portion of that profit you share with the government as payments for the use of the natural resources, which are traditionally considered the ownership of the nation. Putting it into the perspective of the potential natural resources deal with the United States, I think from what I read, and I think it's something in the works still, the the U.S. administration is proposing to split that revenue from that the government will be receiving from these production sharing agreements between the, or rather, channel part of of all of that revenue into the special fund that will be then reinvested into Ukraine. I mean, we are still guessing what the final language will be, but the way it sounded, it looked to me very interesting because the more you invest, the more revenue is generated from the production of, let's say, oil, and the state portion of that production will go into that special fund and will be reinvested in one way or another. But this is great. This is creating new jobs in the Ukrainian economy. I think what many people are missing is that the first bit, Ukraine should be, because of this potential deal, hopefully the Ukrainian government will be more open to attracting more American and, for that matter, foreign investment in general into that area. And this is not government to government, this is investor to government relations. And in our experience, this is very simple at the first stage. There is an electronic auction, simple documents you file, you do it's all transparent. The second stage needs improvement. The negotiation of the production sharing agreement, it still takes too long time. Too many people are involved on the government side. You can definitely improve it. And I think this is one of the top 10 things that the government could do to attract investment. But this is exactly the value that the government could create for foreign investors because, yes, these are opportunities. And if you open up those fields and make investor life easy, then investors will come.
Well, Mykola, let me pick up on a very specific question on natural resources about ownership. And there may be a simple answer or a complicated answer in the context of Ukraine. In many countries, there are different ownership structures. So, for instance, in Yemen, the natural resources of Yemen are owned by the people of Yemen, which makes it exceedingly difficult to do exactly what you just described. In the United States, some is owned by the federal government. Some natural resources are owned by the state governments. Some natural resources are owned by individuals or corporations. So it's highly complex and highly confusing. It's great to be a lawyer in the United States doing natural resources. You can just keep billing the hours forever. Water's complicated, all of that. In Ukraine, is it fairly straightforward that these natural resources are owned by the state, or are there complex layers of ownership of these resources?
Well, it's fairly straightforward, and yet it's complex in other areas. So, like in Yemen, in Ukraine, natural resources, that something that is deep in the ground, is owned by the people, by the nation. But the government is the one the entity is responsible for disposing of those assets or allowing investors to invest into their exploration. So you don't need to deal with the whole nation. You deal with the government agencies that are responsible for that. And the process is fairly straightforward. And admittedly, you are dealing with a complicated investment. And like in most countries, you still need to get a lot of permits. You still have to have technical expertise. You have to have manpower to do that. You have to have a track record. You have to have financial standing to be able to actually perform all of those works and invest the initial money into that exploration stage and then further development stage. And of course, then there are layers like dealing with the municipal governments or on the use of land and potential some private owners. So it is complicated. And I'd be honest with you, it is complicated in every country in the world in its own way. My main message here is that if that opens up, that opportunity opens up, foreign investors could put some moderate business pressure on the government to simplify things. It's not that you need to cancel some of the permits. You can just make them even more straightforward, more electronic, less paperwork, more digital, etc. So there is opportunity there, and there is also some possibility for improvement.
Well, let's shift off of natural resources to a different set of questions. For our listeners, could you help them visualize what are some of the key areas or key industries which would attract foreign investment? And what I have in my mind is whenever I travel to a post-conflict country, the first thing you see is the airport is being rebuilt. And years later, the nicest building is always the airport because apparently airports are quite lucrative. But what other types, highways and infrastructure seems to be something, at least in the Balkans, where there's been quite a bit of investment. But what are we talking about in terms of the top 6 or 7 types of infrastructure or assets or resources that will attract investment in the first year or two?
That's a great question. I keep thinking about that. And off the top of my mind, obviously agriculture is number one. Ukraine is already in some areas a number one producer, for example, of vegetable oil. It's one of the top 3 producers of chicken meat. Of course, grain is a huge export asset for Ukraine and so on. But what opportunity there is actually moving up the value chain, not only exporting raw materials, but actually, let's put it in simple terms. Instead of exporting only grain, export grain and flour, which is more expensive because you put more added value into its production. And same is true for many other areas. One area that has been developing, for example, fruits and berries. Ukraine is a major exporter of berries right now, and it has been exporting them to the European Union despite all the tariffs before the war. Of course, the European Union was generous in reducing or completely lifting the trade barriers for now during the war. But honestly, that area is very competitive, even despite the trade barriers. So agriculture is number one. Number two, I would definitely say it's the metals and the manufacturing. Ukrainian metals industry has been hit hard by the war, but the ore deposits are still in the center of Ukraine that is still being developed. In fact, I can tell you that this is an opportunity, sad, but it's an opportunity for Ukrainian major producers to build new factories, new steel companies that will be up to date, modern, and very efficient, and in terms of electricity, in terms of gases, etc. So this is a huge opportunity, and there is a market. There will be market for it in Ukraine because the reconstruction of various highways, ports, bridges, but also schools and public facilities will require a lot of metal. But of course, in addition to that, Ukraine even now remains a major exporter of iron ore and metal products, and it will continue to. So this is number two. Number three, obviously, is IT. Many people know about the sector, and Ukraine has been a major IT source for major IT companies in the world. But I think now we're taking it to a different level, and that which actually links me to a next area, which is defense production. As most of us know, this war has become a drone warfare. And drones are, on the one hand, manufacturing, engineering, on the one hand, it's IT. And this is a great combination for even for post-war. It's just the use of drones could be dual use. It's not only military, but also in agriculture, in deliveries, logistics, etc. And Ukrainian Ukrainian universities continue to educate really brilliant young generation of IT specialists who then come up with great software and hardware. And I think that this will be a great future and a great opportunity for investors. Now, we already talked about energy and natural resources. This definitely is worthwhile exploring. And I would look at it from different perspectives, both from the traditional energy perspective, oil and gas, coal, etc., but also from the renewables perspective. Ukraine definitely needs more investment into renewables. Before the full-scale invasion, there has been a ton of projects that's invested into wind and solar. I think there will be more. And of course, nuclear power stations have proven to be a very stable, critical source of energy, and more investment into that, especially into small nuclear reactors or micro reactors, would be really beneficial. So energy is definitely on top of my list. And last but not least, you mentioned already, and we discussed this, transport and logistics. And this is a very broad area. It's not only about roads and ports and railway stations, but it's also about all the logistics that comes around it. Various storage facilities, various repacking facilities, reloading facilities, all of that would be very interesting. In fact, this is already happening in Western Ukraine because because of the full-scale invasion, a lot of goods have started moving on through the western border, not only through seaports, and that creates an opportunity. And many people see that it's a safer area, but it is also close proximity to major European hubs. So that creates opportunities for transshipment terminals, where you reload from Ukrainian trucks to European trucks. And that creates interest for investors to build up storage facilities and actually build sometimes even processing plants.
Well, let me pick up on something you just said about the investment culture, the entrepreneurial culture in arms manufacturing and IT and some of these other areas. It's very clear the Ukrainians are entrepreneurial. Let me ask you about your assessment of the entrepreneurial culture for leapfrogging. Oftentimes, everyone talks about rebuilding what was destroyed. As you mentioned, there's an opportunity to leapfrog. And a quick little story, a few weeks ago, I was in Kosovo for their Independence Day celebration. The largest winery in Yugoslavia was in Kosovo, and it made bulk wine. A couple of American and Albanian Americans who had a taste for California wine bought it. They still make bulk wine, but they've created a niche market for high-end Cabernet and Grenache wine was an industrial winemaking enterprise. So they brought that innovation. They're keeping the old foundation in order to keep the profits coming in, but they've leapfrogged to high-end wine in Kosovo and Croatia, and they actually sell here in Washington, D.C. In many post-conflict places, you just want to rebuild the house. You just want to rebuild what used to be there and was destroyed for all kinds of psychological reasons. Or is there this sense that actually there's an opportunity? Let's leapfrog 2 or 3 steps ahead.
Absolutely. Everyone's talking about actually leapfrogging. I think the phrase that quite often you would hear is that it should be built back better. And I'm not sure whether that's a Biden or Trump slogan in the United States, but for sure in Ukraine.
You got to be careful which slogans you use now.
I'm sorry, I'm lost with the political winds. But in Ukraine, that means that we should not, let's take schools. Some schools, unfortunately, have been destroyed. And these schools date back to mid 20th century, some of them, or maybe 80s at best. But they are not up to modern standards. It's not about even safety standards, although safety standards drive them. You need to have a proper basement, in proper shelter in the basement. Not many schools have that. But it's also about everything, the way you plan the open space, the materials you use for kids, the floor, the ceilings, the lighting, etc., the facilities outside of the school. We don't want to rebuild the old facilities. We definitely want to take the opportunity to build brand new schools that would be, and same with hospitals, same with universities. Right now, as we speak, several Ukrainian universities actually using the opportunity and building up their base. One of the universities in Kyiv is actually quickly buying new real estate to build new campuses, new dormitories for students, because they see interest in them. Municipal authorities are building schools. So, and these are only just the grassroots of what will be happening after ceasefire happens hopefully, and the reconstruction, the proper true reconstruction begins. But in terms of examples of leapfrogging, in fact, speaking of wine, there are quite a few wineries in south of Ukraine and in the west of Ukraine, in the Transcarpathia region, where they are also taking those opportunities, very similar to what Kosovo did. It used to be just a regular wine for a super bulk, very cheap wine, and they are now taking it to absolutely different level, and it's really nice. But the same is true, as I mentioned, berries. This Ukraine has never had that at the industrial scale, but it's happening right now. Honey is another example. A lot of manufacturing, furniture manufacturing is happening, light textiles. So I think Ukrainians will definitely use that opportunity. In a different area, taking, for example, financial services, Ukrainians everyone has heard about Revolut in the UK, for example, but Ukrainians have a monobank, which is also a very modern bank that uses very efficient technologies and has grown its tremendous customer base. There are quite a few of these examples. One last example, I'll stop here. Ukraine has a very modern private courier service. It's called New Post or Nova Poshta in Ukrainian. And in fact, they have grown so big is that they actually now are investing outside of Ukraine, in Poland and in Germany and other countries. They have invested in their fleet of trucks, and I think they're about to buy some planes as well. So quite a few Ukrainian companies are actually venturing outside of Ukraine because the Ukrainian market is now becoming small for them.
So they need that economies of scale to go broader. Well, keeping an eye on time, I have 3 more questions for you. Uh, State industrial policy. In the United States here, all of a sudden, we're talking about a state industrial policy, which we haven't talked about since the 60s. We've been all free market and globalization, and let's just roar ahead. Obviously, Ukraine is going to have a state industrial policy. How do you see that shaping up between the energy, the enthusiasm, the investment coming in from the private sector with the need for some organizational structure, I'm trying to avoid using the word, master plan for where is investment directed. How is this going to come together in the most effective way to rebuild and to allow these industries to leapfrog?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ukraine is already thinking about that. In fact, in the last several years, there have been a lot of industrial parks created, primarily in Western Ukraine, but not only. So Ukraine is already driving that industrial policy where the governments want to see more investment happening. And usually these areas, small rural areas or rundown areas that, because of the tax incentives and various permitting incentives, could be interesting to investors to come and become members of that industrial park. So this is one example. Another example is developing of natural resources. The government already has a strategy for the next decade on what to develop and in what areas and what geographic areas to develop. So this, I would definitely watch after it and see where the government steers investors. But there is also a big area which is state-owned enterprises, and I think the government is no. Taking a step back, one big area that hasn't been developed yet is issue of foreign investment control. Surprisingly, except for the entities from Russia, Belarus, Korea, and Iran that are not allowed to invest in Ukraine, Ukraine doesn't have a effective system of foreign investment control like many other states now have. I think this is a matter of time whether this will come, and this will be a tool for the government to actually direct investment and to cut off some investments. And finally, I mentioned state-owned enterprises. SOEs are a big asset for Ukraine. And what worries me is that Ukraine should not go along the road of selling off these assets, 100% privatization. In my view, this would be a mistake. Rather, Ukraine should use that opportunity that the government has such good assets and create a stock market for them, and sell off piece by piece chunks of these shares in the public markets in Ukraine and then, of course, sell the majority stake to interested foreign investors. So I mentioned Ukrenafta, for example. I can easily see in 5 or 7 years the government putting it up for sale, but I dream about Ukrainian government selling off 50% on the liquid market, and the other 50% selling off to the likes of BP, Exxon, and Shell for them to manage. This would be a wiser route, and the government may keep, let's say, a golden share to make sure that nothing wrong happens and the company is not steered in the critically wrong direction.
I think that's the Aramco model in Saudi Arabia. They've started, well, first they nationalized it from from the Brits and the Americans, but then they've been selling off the shares, but keeping the golden share in their own hands. No, when I was doing work in Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of the walls, it was like privatize, privatize, privatize. And then all of a sudden, wait, we should have been smarter about this. We should have issued shares, liquefied it, kept a golden share, then sold off a percentage to a foreign investor. Well, I've got to ask the environmental question. My PhD from back in the 90s was about environmental issues in Central and Eastern Europe, obviously including Ukraine because of Chernobyl, et cetera. Well, what is the plan, or how do you envision that with this tsunami of rebuilding, investment, leapfrogging, what role will environmental protection play? And what are your recommendations or suggestions for continuing to promote private investment, joint ventures, private equity, procurement, without simply erasing environmental regulations like we tend to be doing right now in the United States? How do you find that balance between protecting the environment and bringing in a flood of investment?
It's a very hard question, and I'm afraid I may not have the answer. I definitely support the idea of having a balance. Quite often we see, first of all, Ukrainian environmental regulations are already quite complicated and quite high. And quite often we see that the local communities are protesting against putting up a plant or developing a field for natural resources, etc. Sometimes it's just a case-by-case situation, and you need to consider the environmental aspects. And at least if it's so critical to develop a particular field, then the government and the investor must go extra mile and do extra effort to protect the health of communities and citizens. I mean, we are not in 1960s when everyone was kind of oblivious about the environmental effects and kind of hoped that everything will be fine. We've seen what happens to people and to generations. So we cannot ignore that. On the other hand, I mean, we have to be pragmatic here sometimes, and we need to develop some of these natural resources. So it has to be through discussions, through balance, and responsible actions by the investor. Quite often, it's a matter of creating installing more equipment that catches the pollutants and cleaning more water, or building up special facilities that clean up the whatever comes out of the plants or the field. I think, of course, that requires more investments. And of course, investors want to save on cost as much as they can. But these should be the rules of the game. On the other side, the government should be helping these investors to at least go through the permitting process as fast as they can. And I think this is the challenge for every government, including the Ukrainian government.
Okay, last question. Since you've been so generous with your time, what one key takeaway do you want our listeners to remember 2, 3, 4 years down the road about private sector investment in Ukraine with respect to rebuilding and leapfrogging? What do you want to stick in their brain?
I think there are too many misconceptions or myths about doing business in Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine is has done a lot of progress in terms of efficiency of government services, cutting the bureaucracy, making transparency in government actions and accountability. Ukraine has several dozen for sure, public registers that are accessible to everyone for no fee or token value. Many people think that, who have never invested into Ukraine, that it's too problematic. Everyone hears about corruption, etc. My response to that is, look at those investors who have stayed in Ukraine through decades. Citibank, Coca-Cola, Pepsi Cola, you name it. all of them stayed even through the full-scale invasion and continue investing and continue expanding their operations. That's a testament that actually it's a very friendly environment. Yes, there are issues. There are always issues. There are some contested cases, but the government, especially the Ministry of Digital Transformation, has done tremendous job in cutting the red tape. And in fact, I'll be honest with you, I've been to the United States many times. I lived in the United States. From what I gather, in terms of bureaucracy, Ukraine is way more advanced, more efficient than the United States. So for those investors who are comfortable investing in the United States, and we're talking about post-war economy, they should definitely be comfortable investing into Ukraine. An additional argument for that proposal, Ukraine is doing a lot of actions right now to harmonize this legislation with the EU. So anyone who invests in the EU will probably find the same, in 2 or 3 years, will find the same legislative environment in Ukraine, because Ukraine has to harmonize its legislation with the EU laws to become a member. That's it.
Well, Mykola, I'm glad you left that visual picture in the minds of our audience, because oftentimes you're right, they'll think their information is a decade or 2 decades old. I remember after the fall of the wall, I was working with the Estonians, and they kept telling me, if we can do this in Estonia, if we can be more efficient, if we can have online banking, if we can do this IT, why can't you guys do this? And so, yeah, no, there's outdated perceptions, but oftentimes the leapfrogging occurs quite quickly and facilitates investment. Well, Mykola, it's been a real honor and a privilege to have this conversation with you. In my little bubble, it's peace negotiations and human rights lawyers, and you exist in that bubble as well with your rule of law and your human rights work. But we often forget private sector, private equity, joint ventures, procurement, such an important and an impressive role that private funds play in post-conflict reconstruction and in building a durable and a lasting peace. So I'm really grateful that you've taken the time to walk me and our listeners through how that is likely to play out in the coming years in Ukraine. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your interesting questions and conversation.